Welcome back to This Week. Time now to get the views of our media and political experts, Nashville Representative Brendan Gilmore, Clint Brewer, editor of the Nashville City Paper, and News 2's contributing political analyst Steve Gill. Guys, late this week, the president finally made a decision on the auto bailout. He's going to give GM and Chrysler about $14 million in loans with a lot of paperwork involved, which means if they don't do something to begin turning things around by March, the money could come back. They could go into bankruptcy. Did the president blink? Did he have a choice? I mean, many Southern Republicans didn't want to do anything. Some Northern politicians said you can't let the auto industry go bankrupt.
Well, I think, first of all, it's a loan. That's what they're telling us. But would anybody else make this loan other than George Bush and the Democrats that control Congress and Senate? I think the answer is obviously not, because the likelihood of getting paid back is between slim and none. I think the other thing is you've got the United Auto Workers that have a big, fancy, gold-plated golf course up in Michigan that we hadn't heard much about. Maybe they ought to sell their golf course before they come to the taxpayers looking for money.
I don't think he blinked. I don't think he ever had any thought of doing anything other than make this bailout happen. I mean, from the get-go, he wanted to do this, and I think that he sees it perhaps as a way to end his administration on what many of his detractors might consider somewhat of a positive note.
And 18% of people said that they would not miss the president. I don't think this president wanted to see the big three fail on his watch. But most importantly, if the big three, I don't think we can take that risk. There are something like 2 million jobs that would be affected if those car dealerships and all of them went out of business all of a sudden. So I think the president didn't have any choice. Even though it's not popular with the citizens right now, I think he had to save them.
There would be a ripple effect if they all three went under in the South, too, because a lot of suppliers, even if they're foreign car suppliers, but some American car suppliers would be affected by it as well.
That's one of the keys people miss. Ford is actually being left out of the bailout, if I understand correctly. So they're not getting any of this money, but the problem is, and Ford's spoken openly about this, the big three share so many suppliers that if the first two don't get bailed out, it might pull the only healthy one under.
Well, I think that's part of what's happening here. You had banks also that decided to not get into the financial bailout because opening your door to the government coming in to run your business carries some downside as well as some upside. I think Ford's made the right decision that they got a better chance of making it without the government telling them how to run their business. The problem is consumers aren't buying cars. These guys are still going to turn out cars that people aren't buying. That's not going to solve the problem in our economy. Getting consumers back on those lots buying cars is where the car dealers will then start ordering cars. And until we get back to the consumer side, this isn't going to work.
Well, and I think that the most important thing we've got to do is we can't just keep giving money over without any kind of criteria or watchdogs or monitoring. And that's what we've done in the past, and that's where we've failed. But we've got to help these guys. And I know that they're not the most likable people. We see them keep giving out bonuses, and we see them keep going to these elaborate spas and resorts, but because so much of America is dependent on them, we can't take the risk of letting them sink.
And unfortunately, that high living lifestyle is not just the auto execs, it's the union execs that are doing the same thing. Again, they own a golf course. Do they really need a UAW-owned golf course in Michigan for their execs to be able to play on? I think we got to clean up this mess of both the auto executives and the union executives before anybody in America is going to think these guys deserve our help.
Some good economic news for Tennessee this week when it was announced that Hemlock Semiconductors is going to be building a huge plant, $1 billion project in Clarksville. You add that on top of the $1 billion-plus VW plant in Chattanooga, and in this really bad economy, those are two big pluses for Tennessee.
It's a huge story, and I want to put in a little plug. Our website, nationalpost.com, broke the story.
Week.
Yes, exactly, last week. It is an absolutely huge win for the Bredesen administration. Comes on the tails of the Volkswagen win. And, it's great to see in these kind of times the state getting this kind of traction, and that takes a long-term approach.
I think it's really smart, and I'm excited for Tennesseans. It's going to put a lot of people back to work. But most important, it lines up with President-elect Obama's platform because he's going to be creating green jobs. So the fact that we're getting this solar plant there in Clarksville shows that we're thinking globally. We're just not thinking about what's happening in Clarksville, Tennessee. It's going to put Clarksville on the map and Tennessee on the map, certainly.
I think Tennessee is ripe to continue to gain more of these wins as well. You look at California, that's in a huge budget disaster. Michigan, where this company's coming from. You look at New York. And their answer in all those states is to raise taxes and force more businesses out. And I think the Bredesen administration ought to be putting up the open for business sign saying, y'all come on down.
Seems like the Bredesen administration is looking at these numbers and still not backing off of the possibility of $1 billion deficit, but is now talking to his department head saying prepare a budget of a 15% cut instead of maybe a 20% cut, a little bit of good news.
Well, and hopefully it's a reflection that some of the dire numbers that they've been basing projections on are based heavily on what happened in October and November, where in large parts of Middle Tennessee, we not only had $4 a gallon gasoline, we had no gasoline, which completely shelved all shopping, all travel, and everything. So I think it might have distorted the numbers a little bit, so hopefully they'll be a little bit better as we move ahead.
I think if you follow the Bredesen administration, you know that Phil Bredesen's a little bit different governor than we had in the past. He starts working on the next year's budget sometime early in the fall. So for him, it's more of an 8-month process, where a lot of governors have made it more of a 2-month process. So I think we could probably trust those numbers and maybe even rely on them and have that hope you're talking about.
I think also there's some acknowledgement that we're beginning to, when you talk about a 15% cut and a 20% cut, you're really beginning to cut into the flourish. It's not just travel that you can take away, and it's not just those feel-good type services like training. You're beginning to cut people. And just last year, we trimmed 1,200 people. So we don't want the services to affect become less than efficient to our constituents, and that's something we got to make sure that we don't do.
Although I hope the legislature will really look at the numbers hard, because I think Brenda's right. They're talking about 15% cuts. The problem is we've got about a 3% budget shortfall. We've got a $28 billion budget, maybe an $800 million shortfall. Why we're needing 15% cuts with a 3% shortfall, I think the math needs to be scrutinized a little bit more than it has been to date.
And we did. We took last year probably about $400 million out of our reserve, and I think we need to be careful that we don't deplete those reserves, and that's something we've got to look at also.
When the legislature goes back in less than a month now, there will be new leadership, the Republicans will be in control. Will this economic downturn, the problems with it, still be the #1 priority, or are we going to see a different kind of shift when the legislature convenes?
I think what you'll see is the new Republican majority focus on their own kind of economic stimulus package, but they're going to do it in a couple of ways. One, I think you're going to see the tap opened on new infrastructure projects in the state, and infrastructure projects tied to economic development. The other thing is I think you're going to see an effort to deregulate some on business. I think their idea is to take the government reins off and to, as Steve said, hang an open for business sign on the state of Tennessee.
I think our goal is to go back and to focus on creating jobs and getting Tennesseans back to work. There are a lot of people in this state, and there are a lot of people in this country who are actually losing their jobs. In the past, you may have said, I saw something on TV last night of people losing their jobs. Now we actually know of people losing their jobs. So my hope as a legislator that we go back and we get serious about creating jobs, about holding the lines on no new taxes. I hope we don't get mired down on talking about some of those kind of wedge issues that divide us and get people all excited and emotional, and you come back 2 years later and those issues are still on the table.
I don't think it's going to actually be very, very partisan, and I think the wedge issues that Brenda's talking about are actually going to be things that pass by huge majorities, because a lot of things have been locked up in committee under House Speaker Jimmy Nafee that are going to come to the floor, and a lot of Democrats and Republicans will join together and pass some of these so-called wedge issues by large majorities.
Will the average Tennessean, the average voter out there, see a difference in how Capitol Hill is operated? Will there be different issues discussed that maybe weren't discussed in the past?
I think we're calling them wedge issues. I think they're also hot-button issues. I think you're going to see some social issues like abortion, like gun rights, things like that come to the fore where they have been bottled up in committees before. And I think what Steve's talking about is you're going to see some rural Democrats who were afraid to vote under Nafee come back and vote with the Republicans.
And I think that there are probably going to be a lot of issues that will make it out of committee, but when they get to the floor, we're going to see some real fights, and we're going to try hard not to be partisan, and I hope we don't, because the Tennesseans really want us to be serious about the issues out there and not to see us fighting up there. But realistically, when we get on the floor, I think that there are going to be some fights.
Clint Brewer, Steve Gill, appreciate your insight. Stay with us as we continue in a moment.